Oh, so you have a problem with what happened at the Capitol, but nobody had a problem when Black Lives Matter was burning down cities. You have no doubt heard some variation of that claim in the past week, and although it's entirely pointless and a complete waste of time to engage with diehard Trump supporters, a disappointingly large number of regular people have also expressed a similar sentiment. So, let's examine the claim that what happened at the Capitol last week is no different than Black Lives Matter protests. First of all, if you think there's no difference between Black Lives Matter protests and the MAGA insurrection at the Capitol, shut the fuck up. Secondly, seriously, shut the fuck up. Okay, for real now. Let's first look at the intent. One group is fighting to take their country back. One group is fighting to move forward. Black Lives Matter is fighting for equality and change. MAGA is fighting to maintain the status quo, to uphold white supremacy. What is it about the year 1776 that MAGA loves so much? Who exactly had all the power back then? BLM protests are in the name of justice for the powerless and accountability for the powerful. The rage that many black people and people of color feel is based on historic oppression and systemic racism. They are specifically protesting police brutality, begging to not be killed in the streets, or at the very least, to hold cops accountable for killing people in the streets. Seems pretty reasonable to me. The MAGA riot was in the name of white grievance. MAGA babies are upset their daddy lost. Their rage is based on a lie that the election was stolen, so they're fighting to keep their fascist leader in power through the use of violence and threats so they can maintain a white supremacist power structure. It's no coincidence that the day before the riot, a black man and a Jewish man won their elections in Georgia to take control of the Senate, and that they're protesting the legitimate election of the first black woman vice president. They're suffering from white lash, and they're big mad. Just look at the difference in diversity at these events. BLM protests have black people, white people, brown people, LGBT people. If you want unity, go to a Black Lives Matter protest. And they're not protesting against or for any politician or political party. They are protesting against police brutality. That is it. The MAGA riot was all for one man. One despicable, disgusting con man. Now, to be fair, there was a lot of diversity at the MAGA riot and MAGA rallies. There are anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, QAnon people, there are German Americans, Irish Americans, Polish Americans, all types of European Americans. It's a virtual rainbow coalition of racist and conspiracists. This idea that nobody had a problem with the Black Lives Matter riots is just laughable. Even Joe Biden condemned the riots more than he condemned the killer cops. Local cops treated every protest as a riot. The entire federal government treated every protest as a riot. Trump sends his fucking goons to storm the Capitol and calls them special people, but every Black Lives Matter protester is a terrorist according to him. He creates this whole new fucking law just to fuck with Black Lives Matter protesters. Ironically, that law will now be used against his insurrectionists. Oopsie. The notion that Black Lives Matter protests are all riots is of course bullshit, but Trump and Republicans and a lot of the media have endlessly repeated that, so a lot of Americans have become convinced, and that was always the goal, to create this false equivalency and to deflect from the fact that there has always been more violence in this country from right-wing extremists than any other group. I've heard people say shit like, oh, no one ever talks about all the cops killed at Black Lives Matter protests. You're right, because that never happened. In 2016, a madman went on a shooting spree in Dallas and killed 5 cops while a Black Lives Matter protest was happening. That is true, but he wasn't part of the protest. In fact, 2 protesters got shot. That's the entirety of cops killed at Black Lives Matter protests. Yet last year, a Boogaloo Boy, a right-wing extremist, murdered a cop. And at the Capitol riot, the entire fucking MAGA mob killed a cop and beat the shit out of other cops with thin blue line flags and American flags. Out of respect, I guess. There have been thousands of peaceful Black Lives Matter protests just last year alone, and the very few that did turn violent only did so after cops got aggressive. Cops came through in riot gear and shot tear gas at a violin vigil for Elijah McClain. At some protests, they were shooting tear gas into people's front porches. Independent investigations have found that cops in Philly, Boston, New York, all over the country acted irresponsibly and aggressively during the George Floyd protests. Mayor de Blasio right now is getting sued because he knew and approved of the NYPD consistently beating the shit out of peaceful protesters. The different police response to Black Lives Matter protests and the MAGA riot is a perfect representation of white privilege, and it's a big reason that BLM protests in the first place. For the Capitol riot, the cops barely showed up, and many of the ones who did were acting like it was a Toby Keith concert, just having a good old time. This was a failure on a massive scale, and it wasn't due to a lack of funding or a lack of training. It was a lack of desire to stop what was happening. The MAGA riot at the Capitol had been planned for weeks, yet cops didn't prepare like they would for a fucking candlelight vigil for a black man murdered by the cops. And they'll arrest Black Lives Matter protesters and keep them in a cell for a couple nights and then eventually just drop all the bullshit charges. But for the MAGA terrorists, they just let them leave. See, the cops don't view white supremacist Trumpers as a threat, even when they're getting dragged down the fucking stairs and beaten. But they view BLM as a threat. See, they're hostile to Black Lives Matter, but sympathetic to MAGA. And that, my friends, is the most important difference. Black Lives Matter rages against the machine, MAGA rages for the machine. MAGA is the machine. 2 Capitol cops have already been arrested, and 20 others are under investigation for participating in the riot. Cops from all over the country were part of that MAGA mob. They were in there flashing their badges and their IDs to the Capitol cops, saying, "Hey, we're on your side. This is for your own good. It's okay. Trump invited us here." So no, Black Lives Matter protests and the moron MAGA march to the Capitol are not the same. Not even a little bit. And if you think they are the same, you might not mean to be racist, but you are.